faculty and students is the core of this place. And I tried yesterday to articulate some thoughts on that matter, and we will continue to do so across the year. But the fundamental issue at the center of it all is the relationship, the community that we build here at the new school, and the ways in which that community helps us to navigate the complexities of the times we live in and the critical issues that you're addressing in your studios and seminars and classrooms and practice rooms and all of the various ways in which you are engaging with students across the university. And so I just wanted to say welcome and to thank you for this deep and important work that you do.
Thank you so much, Joel. And now I'm really so pleased to welcome our provost, Renee T. White.
Thanks so much, Rita. So first of all, just good morning, everybody. And I'm so happy to have this opportunity to just offer some brief welcome, and just to say as well, alongside Joel, that, I am very excited to have the opportunity to meet with you, to get to know you. There are a couple of gatherings that we're going to be hosting over the next few weeks. And so we're going to have a reception for faculty, and highly recommend, if you can, please come to that. It's always a good time. It's a great way to just get a different feel for the campus and for how we are together and how we connect with one another. I also will be doing some version of something I started a couple years ago. I do open office hours, and those are for small groups, faculty, staff, and students, and we talk about a range of different things. I'm going to structure it a little differently this year, but you will be getting invitations. It is open to all faculty as well as staff and students. So again, would love to have that opportunity to connect with you. Just really briefly, I am a sociologist and a Black feminist scholar. So I have an appointment in NSSR. And I just celebrated my 3 years of being at the new school just a couple weeks ago. So my time here has been in relation to my role as provost, and I'm, very much looking forward to what kind of work, thank you, Tina, what kind of work will come from having you all here. So I know you have a lot scheduled for today. And again, thank you to Rita and, all of your folks for, always making sure to provide a really warm welcome for faculty.
Thanks so much, Renee. And now, Kate Evanishin.
Thank you so much, Rita, and thank you, Joel and Renee, for attending this morning. My name is Kate Evanishin. I'm the Associate Provost of University Part-Time Faculty Affairs, and that means I work for you. We are so thrilled to have you here. Our office works very closely with various areas of the university, alongside our two unions, Local 802 and 7902, who represent all of our part-time faculty. We're here to help you find your way, right? We have a non-person email account that my colleague Mimi will put intermittently into the chat, that you can email at any time should you require any assistance, need to figure something out. I don't know how to do this thing. How do I do this thing? And also check our area in the Provost website, where we have information about faculty development and different kinds of opportunities. I want to welcome you today. I'm going to put myself on mute, and I'm going to introduce my colleague Mimi Tu Ayala, who's our program manager and also works for you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mimi Tu Ayala. I am the program manager for University PTF Affairs. So I am the face to, answering all of your questions when you email the non-person email. So yeah, nice meeting you all.
And the last of our introductions is Katie Warner. Katie?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Kate and Rita and Renee and Joel, for your wonderful, warm welcomes. My name's Katie Warner. I'm the Director of Faculty Affairs in the Provost Office. My main focus is full-time faculty, though, of course, working very closely with Kate and her team and Rita and her team. That being said, just welcome. I'm going to jump on mute as well, and we'll really get things rolling. Great to meet everyone.
Thanks, Katie. So for those of you who have been joining, once again, my name is Rita Breidenbach. We're going to now start the formal presentation, which I will be doing with my colleagues, Sheena and Sophia. You'll meet them when they start rather than taking time to introduce. I am your host for today. This is a full 2-hour session, and that's a long time. One of the things that we advocate is taking a trauma-informed approach to teaching. And in part, that means recognizing and acknowledging their needs. So today's session is focused on approaches to teaching that promote equity and inclusion, because frankly, you can't be a good teacher without ensuring an equitable and inclusive learning environment. At the end, we'll put several links in the chat, the first of which is to our Guide to Teaching and Learning, which is a great resource on a variety of teaching issues and includes a whole section on New School Resources, which is a collection of short videos and introductions to a number of student and faculty resources that are there when you need them, rather than us trying to review them all with you now so that you can forget it. Please skim what's available and then remember that it's there and return to it when you need to. Finally, we will send you the scintillatingly titled New School Teaching handout, which includes brief introductions to concepts and strategies in teaching, but it begins with suggestions for how to build community, because the classroom is community, and suggestions for having difficult dialogue, followed by a number of different scenarios of when things get sticky or even go wrong between faculty and students. Yes, the scenarios are real, even at the New School. I will say that the majority of them enact interactions that involve experiences of white faculty, but it also includes a number of scenarios that minoritized faculty encounter with their students. They'll get you thinking. The emphasis of this morning's presentation is how to create a classroom environment in which all people in the class, faculty and students alike, are respected, seen, and heard. Throughout this presentation, we'll be trying to practice transparency, which is a foundation of teaching for equity and inclusion. What, why, and how are important for promoting engagement and communicating transparency of expectations, even down to how much time students should expect to spend on a particular activity, because otherwise, how will they know? There's nothing like spending 2 hours on something when the instructor thought you'd spend 20 minutes. Also, there's a saying I like to quote from a beloved colleague and economics professor. Math is taught by people for whom math is easy. In other words, you already know how to think about the stuff you're teaching and probably do it like breathing. Most of your students will have no idea. Concepts that are so natural for you that you don't even need to think about them. Students may have no clue. Now, last thing, unfortunately, because of our numbers and what we have to cover, we will not be doing what we're going to be encouraging you to do, which is employ active learning strategies and practices, because this Zoom lecture is not the best way to learn. There was a study a number of years ago that showed that people watching TV actually displayed greater brain activity than those listening to a lecture. But we are constrained, so we'll do our best to keep your brain activity elevated. So in the interest of transparency, we're going to begin by talking about the value of community agreements and also to model creating a supportive and inclusive learning environment, even on Zoom with several dozen people. We're putting a fair amount of emphasis on having this discussion because students today need to understand why they need to come to class, why they need to be on time, and how it impacts their fellow students if they're late, why they need to do the homework assigned for the class before the class, and why deadlines matter. This is a conversation that we're encouraging faculty to have with students, especially undergraduate students. Many of our younger students were deeply impacted by the pandemic and online learning. They learned that they didn't need to do the work in real time because they could find their materials online. And everyone promoted flexibility. Because they were learning and socializing remotely during this critical time in their emotional and social development, they didn't learn that as a student, they actually have an obligation to show up, because the best learning happens collectively with fellow students and their faculty, not just alone online. A discussion of community agreements sets the framework for a conversation about either why you have the attendance policy you do, or better yet, invites students to co-create an attendance policy, and maybe to stipulate the consequences when someone is late or misses a class. Students may actually be harsher than you are, and the first time a student who's late is prevented from entering the classroom and they're waving outside the door, you can revisit what they agreed to, because you're going to want to let them in. We're also anticipating that this may be a difficult semester, with the war in the Middle East continuing and with an election in November. Establishing community agreements sets the table for respectful conversations in which we agree to hear and listen to each other. Following that, we're going to talk about one example of a warm-up exercise that we like to use to encourage a willingness to be vulnerable and open to the things we'll be discussing. Because of the size of this group, we won't use it, but we wanted to introduce it as something you might want to employ in class. I will very quickly introduce some concepts and practices in pedagogy, because most people teaching in higher education have never actually learned how to teach. And the idea is to encourage you to explore more on your own. We'll briefly introduce the concept of implicit bias to frame our thinking for the remainder of the presentation. Now, I've just said implicit bias. We all have implicit biases because we are all human beings. It's important to recognize that we all have implicit biases in order to begin to address how those we're unconscious of impact our teaching and our students. We'll define equality and equity, and then introduce principles of inclusive teaching. Now, they're framed as inclusive teaching, but honestly, they're simply good teaching practices, period. But most importantly, as I just said, you can't be a good teacher without ensuring an equitable and inclusive learning environment. Finally, we'll talk again about implicit bias and self-awareness. So to begin, community agreements are a tool to introduce into your classroom to lay a strong foundation for a supportive and equitable space that makes clear that all voices are heard. They create a space that values speaking from one's own experience, not expecting someone to speak for an entire identity group. It asks that students speak only for themselves and from their own lived experience, making no assumptions about others, even if they look like them or from the same country or identity group. They provide a framework to address tense or loaded topics in a way that is equitable, listening to and valuing all voices and viewpoints, whether or not we agree. They promote respectful dialogue, and they are a tool of accountability for the entire class, including the instructor. We're going to present the main ones that we think are important and why, but we're not saying that you should just hand these to your students. It's the development of the agreements with your community of learners that is going to begin to build that community and that sense of mutual accountability and responsibility. They also foster greater equity and inclusion, and in a classroom setting, they can prevent problems from happening and can be a great place to return to when emotions or tensions are running high. Now, following the Hamas attack on Israel and Israel's ongoing war in Gaza, some classrooms have become fraught, even if the course content is completely unrelated. Some faculty choose to check in with their students and ask how you're feeling, which is a good idea in general, not necessarily specific to the war. And as I said, there's an election coming up. We live in challenging times. If you choose to ask your students, how are you doing? It's wise to have established community agreements with your class, and we're going to talk now about how to do that. This is the best way to create a space where complex conversations can occur in a respectful and educational way. Sheena?
Okay, so these community agreements are where we like to start. So the first one, we will make I statements. That means I can speak only from what I know, I think, I feel, I hear. As in, I heard you say, rather than something like, well, you said, which is the prelude to an argument, rather than an invitation to a discussion. Because I heard you say is usually followed by something like, well, that's not what I meant, which gets us to intent versus impact. Because your intent may have been benign or even supportive, but if that impact was hurtful, offensive, or dismissive of my experience and what I was communicating, then it really doesn't matter what the intent was, because it's not about who said the thoughtless or unintentionally cruel thing. It's about the person who was hurt. So apologize. One mic. That means only one person is talking at a time. And that's directly related to practice active listening. This is really, really important for supporting tricky and fraught conversation. Active listening means don't sit there thinking about how you'll respond, but focus on what's really being said and try to listen for what's not being said. Ask yourself, does something need to be added here? Am I the one to say it? And allow for silence while others think about that. And make no assumptions about anything, because people do, about everything. And finally, safe versus brave, comfortable and unchallenged versus uncomfortable and challenged. We cannot guarantee student safety from unintended hurtful remarks, from ugly images, from painful history, but we can all agree to be brave in the face of those challenges. And we can agree to be uncomfortable together through these practices. That's where we learn. These are some additional practices that foster a space in which all voices are heard and respected, and in which we acknowledge impact, even when intentions come from a well-meaning place. So first, we will criticize ideas, not people. This means instead of calling attention to the person who has said something offensive or otherwise harmful, we will critique and correct what they said. Move up, move up. This is a good classroom management tool. It means if you usually don't talk much, challenge yourself to speak up more. If you've been speaking more than others, challenge yourself to listen more. And it's a very good classroom management tool for the quietest and most loquacious students. Honor silence. Sometimes people just need to sit with it and ask questions, listen to and hear the responses. And these next couple are very important. We can't be articulate all the time. Show your students you make mistakes. It lowers the stakes for them to make them too. And also acknowledge that if and when we cause harm or make a mistake, we hope we all can agree to engage with each other with grace and understanding and not with accusations. Returning to, I heard you say, as opposed to, well, you said, can open up that conversation rather than instigate an argument. No one knows everything. We all know something. Together, we know a lot. This sort of community agreement reminds your students of their roles as contributors to the classroom and to everyone's learning, and also that you're continuing to learn too. And importantly, that you're learning from them. Our students, especially US American students recently out of high school, are a lot more knowledgeable about issues of equity, diversity, race, ability, size, all of that than many of us. Recognize that they know things that we don't, and don't be afraid of that. So these now are some new ones we're proposing that you discuss with your students. In the last few semesters, faculty have lamented that students don't come to class, don't do the work, and even wonder why they need to. One of the most significant and distressing consequences of the pandemic learning was that students didn't develop that sense of mutual responsibility for each other and for their teachers. They didn't develop that sense of community. It was all online, and a lot of it was alone. When we're together in person in a classroom with the instructor in real life, we learn so much more than we can learn even together on Zoom. We need to talk to students about this. We're social beings who actually need to be together. We need eye contact. We need to hear nuance. We need to see people's movements and body language. We need to hear laughter. We need to help students understand that learning takes deep, interpersonal, human connections, and we have a responsibility to each other. That's why you have to come to class. That's why you got to do the work, because if you don't, everyone suffers. So consider these possibilities. We agree to support each other as learners. We agree to come to class unless we're unwell. Here, you could talk about why being in a classroom together is very different from just reading or viewing materials online. That being together, you're in community. You observe people's reactions. You hear tone of voice. You learn from each other and each other's differing perspectives, because people hear things differently, see things differently, and learn differently. We agree to be on time. You can talk about how disruptive it is for everyone when someone comes in late. The mental energy disruption costs us, and the challenge of getting back on track. And it's actually really important, because every decision we make, whether we're looking at our phones, sending a text, picking nose, all requires mental energy, and too much of it leads to exhaustion, because every decision, no matter how big or how small, uses up the same energy. You could even consider talking with students about what the consequences should be for missing class or for coming in late. And we add, ask for help if we're having trouble being on time, because we want to assume that students do want to be on time. They're just struggling. We agree to do the work. And then you can talk about the impact of one person not doing the work on all those who have done it, and even on yourself. And we'll ask questions. Help students think more intentionally as learners together, and know that if one person doesn't understand something, there's probably someone else who doesn't understand either, and we help each other by asking questions. So how to implement? So community agreements establish how we agree to be together as a community for the next 15 weeks. And they can be introduced at any time, but they're most effective from the outset, from the first day. Though because of add drop, you'll need to reintroduce them a few times, but that's worth doing, because those who have heard it are reminded, and those who are new have the chance to weigh in. You can draft a few examples, introduce them to students, and invite them to add to and modify the list until you come to an agreement on your community agreements. And be sure that all students agree. We've seen faculty who have community agreements, but they don't use them. That means they put them on their syllabus, but they don't discuss them with their students, and they don't invite students to modify them. They don't ask students actively to agree to hold each other accountable and to hold the faculty member accountable through the agreements. But tools are only as good as the hands that wield them, right? If you don't use community agreements effectively, then they're not going to be effective. You can't just introduce them on the first day and think, okay, I have community agreements. No, you need to revisit them. You need to ask students if any of them should be modified, and if any should be added or removed, and revisit and modify them again, and revisit them, especially as things get sticky, as this fall they undoubtedly will. What you're really trying to do is set up a space where people can hear each other and be present for each other. And a key thing to remember is to slow down, to stop, and to think.
So as I mentioned, we wanted to introduce a warm-up. This is one that we find particularly effective for encouraging vulnerability and risk-taking. Invite students to share their name and pronouns if they choose. The new school does not have a pronoun policy. Our advice is simply invite if they choose to share. And then ask them to respond to these two prompts using these exact words, because people always try to mess with the words here, and it actually changes the way you respond. So one thing you can't tell about me just by looking at me is my name is Rita. My pronouns are she and her. One thing you can't tell about me just by looking at me is that until 8 years ago, my name was Kathleen. And then I go into a story about the horrible personal experience. And then I say, and it's important for me to tell you that because it has completely changed the way I, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I stress that they don't have to share anything that's deeply personal, and they can even pass if they want. This actually promotes a performance anxiety in some students because they feel like they need to measure up to another person's what they shared. But it really does promote a willingness to be vulnerable. And just one note on how it starts. If it starts very superficial, one thing you can't know about me is that I have a red car. It will stay that way. So when I use this warm up, I usually start it off. We also want to recognize that there are, whoa, talk about being vulnerable. Sorry, I just got really lightheaded there. That was interesting. We want to recognize that not all faculty, especially faculty of color, faculty who are trans, who are women, not all faculty feel they can express vulnerability. You'll have to see how you feel in your classroom, but being willing to be vulnerable invites trust. And the value of trust is you hope students who, for instance, have concerns about the course or something that you did, or another student in the class, or whatever is going on in the world that day, that they will feel comfortable enough approaching you with their concerns when they arise so that they can be more easily dealt with and they're not allowed to fester. Okay, switching track. We're going to do a brief foray into talking about teaching. In the last 30 years, there's been a lot of research into how we actually learn things, first propelled by faculty in the science, technology, engineering, and math fields. With the rise of research in cognitive neuroscience, we're actually beginning to know how brains work, which means we can adopt practices supported by what we know to be effective in helping students learn and grow. As I said earlier, most faculty in higher ed have never actually learned how to teach. They tend to teach what they were taught the way they were taught it. It's very important that we think intentionally about what we want students to learn and how we're going to help them get there. Before we focus more on inclusive teaching practices, we want to introduce some basic active learning strategies, like not what we're doing here, and some concepts in teaching. You'll find more about them in the teaching handout that we'll share with you and in the guide to teaching and learning. This is a whistle wetter to entice you to learn more. So active learning strategies can include writing to learn, which is using nonstop, no pre-thinking writing to respond to a prompt, a concept, an image, a piece of music. Drawing to learn uses drawing in the same way. Group or team-based activities are just what it sounds like, though it's important that groups are clearly structured and that students know how they'll be evaluated both individually and as a group. Can also invite groups to determine how they're going to be evaluated. Guided inquiry is when the teacher provides a kind of scaffold or roadmap that leads students intentionally toward more complex concepts and deeper insights. And problem-based learning, which is usually team-based, is structured around real-world or realistic problems and is very holistic and effective in leading students to develop kind of whole picture understanding. All these kinds of strategies encourage and foster deeper learning because students are figuring things out by themselves and together with each other, but in an intentional and supported way. Backward design is about how you design your class. I know many of you, or most of you, are starting to teach next week. Hopefully you already have your syllabus. I also know that some of you, especially our part-time faculty, don't have a lot of latitude in what or how you would teach your assigned course. But I mention it here so that as you start to teach, you might think about how what you're doing might have benefited from using this approach and what changes you might make in the moment or in the future. In backward design, you start by asking yourself, what do I want students to learn? How will I know if they've learned it? And then how can I help them get there? You build the course from the end and then figure out what learning activities will lead them there in scaffolded ways, ways that build on each activity incrementally so that students are building on bite-sized chunks of learning and feel challenged but not overwhelmed. And those bites need to be even a little smaller now, given how many of our students are anxious, stressed, and depressed. Also, more risk averse. So they benefit from multiple either no stakes or low stakes assignments, so they can just try things out without risk. Mindset is the belief that brains are malleable and that we are not limited by innate talent or intelligence. It's the belief that with effective effort, we are capable of learning and growing. And we know from brain science that that's actually true. In fact, it's how we learn. So part of inclusive teaching means, one, not assuming everyone can see, and two, not assuming everyone sees the same thing. So the image on the screen is one type of graphical representation of Bloom's taxonomy. So what I see here is an image of what I'll call a stacked pyramid of increasingly smaller rings, kind of like a toddler's stacking toy. The rings are colored from dark red at the bottom and then graduate to pinkish, or my husband would call it beige, at the top. The bottom ring says, remember. Then above that, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and finally at the pinnacle, create. To the right of each ring is a long ribbon in the same color as its corresponding ring with a further description of each of those concepts. Many faculty are somewhat familiar with or maybe have heard of Bloom's taxonomy, which was created to promote higher forms of thinking in education, such as analyzing and evaluating concepts, processes, procedures, and principles, rather than just focusing on remembering facts or rote learning. One value of showing this image to students is that the foundation is remembering. Students think they don't need to remember because they all have Google in their hands and now they've got ChatGPT, right? But it's important to embed knowledge in your mind because it helps the brain make connections that Google can't make across different subjects, processes, and domains. And memory is the foundation of creativity. We have to remember things to develop higher forms of thinking, learning, and creating. Importantly, there are two other taxonomies modeled on this one. The psychomotor, which includes things like learning to make a hat or play the bassoon, and the affective, our emotions and our value system. I mention these two because many faculty tend to think of students from the forehead up. And it's important to remember that their brains are in bodies that feel emotion. Connecting learning to physical actions, even if the content of the course has nothing to do with movement. I teach poetry. At least 1 week, I ask students to dance a poem, and it's amazing. what they learn. Linking content to movement and our emotional reactions and connections deepens student learning. Flowing from Bloom's, other education thinkers and scientists have created different taxonomies, some less or more or less hierarchical. One that I actually prefer is called the taxonomy of significant learning, because it begins with learning to learn. This is a wheel. I really like this one because it's much more holistic than Bloom's and it's iterative. Learning feeds learning. The image here looks like a bicycle wheel with thick red arrows for the tire and thin black spokes that break into 6 areas or slices of pie. Starting with the upper right, it all begins with learning how to learn. We're going to be sharing with you materials that you can actually share with students on helping students learn to learn and become better learners and self-directed learners. Next is foundational knowledge, understanding and remembering. The third sextant is application, including skills, thinking critically, creatively, and practically. Next is integration, or making connections across ideas, people, and realms of life. It incorporates both intellection and emotional elements, and importantly, is not something that generative AI tools can do. The fifth slice of the pie is labeled the human dimension, learning about yourself and others cognitively, affectively, or emotionally, and physiologically. And finally, the last, all these others lead up to caring, developing new feelings, interests, and values. In this schema, what we see is that higher order learning is actually affective, emotional development, not just knowledge, but what higher education really should be doing, teaching discernment, how to evaluate and assess and compare and make judgments, and how to be open to others. And then, because it's a wheel, we're back to learning how to learn. What I appreciate about this taxonomy is that it encourages us to remember that our students are whole beings, and teaching this taxonomy to our students encourages them to see learning as a continual and iterative process, and especially that learning how to learn and becoming better students is foundational. It shows that learning leads to caring, development of empathy, and a willingness to embrace difference. Even if we don't like what someone is saying, we can try to understand why they're saying it. And that is so important right now. We will be sharing with you materials that we developed for faculty teaching first-year students that are intended for giving to students to promote skills development, like how to take notes, how to listen, how to think, because most students these days have actually not learned how to learn. Sophia.
So all of this leads us to metacognition, which is the foundation of learning how to learn. Metacognition includes a critical awareness of and self-reflection on one's thinking and learning, and of oneself as a thinker and learner. Metacognitive practices are particularly important for our current students with their short attention spans and desire to multitask, or tendency to multitask. And metacognition can help them become conscious of their many unconscious behaviors while also strengthening their learning. As students plan their approach to an activity or assignment, ask them to monitor what they're learning about themselves in the process, and evaluate how the process went in different contexts, like a lecture versus a discussion, a reading versus watching a video, participating in a making activity, or even group work. You can ask them to ask themselves questions like, how did I go about approaching the assignment? What was most confusing about the material I was reading? Why and what might I have done differently? How did taking a short break affect my attention to the reading? As I said, it's all about, or as Rita said, I think, as one of us said, it's all about making conscious the unconscious activities, practices, and ways of being that affect learning. One of the 3 key findings in the publication, How People Learn, which is a huge study into neurocognitive processes of learning, is around the effectiveness of metacognitive approaches to instruction for improving student learning. In other words, all of this works. It's wonderful. It can be really like profound for students to start to think of themselves as learners. And it's also very simple, pretty simple to implement. And metacognition is also wonderful because it's a practice that you yourself can use as an instructor thinking about how you teach. So we talked about intentional course design, and we asked that faculty also be intentional in their interactions with students. Our classrooms can, intentionally or not, replicate the power dynamics and injustices that we see in greater society. As faculty in a position of authority, we have the responsibility to look for and understand how this happens so we can help our students thrive. So we ask you to learn to intentionally incorporate pedagogical principles of equity in order to cultivate learning environments where all students feel respected, valued, and supported. And we ask that you engage in some self-reflection about our own identity. All of us should be engaging in self-reflection around our own identities, our biases, and our role in disrupting the cycle of oppression, because we do all have a role. And some of what we will share today includes concepts and practices you can immediately incorporate into your teaching, like the community agreements. But much of this work is personal and internal, and it takes a true willingness to be open and to listen, to learn, and to change.
Okay, so who here is biased? We all are. And implicit bias is automatic. We're wired to think in categories and to make snap judgments in fractions of a second, and it probably starts before we're born. That 4th point, implicit cognition, refers to unconscious influences such as knowledge, perception, or memory that influence our behavior, even when we have no conscious awareness of those influences. We all have biases. It's how humans evolved to survive. Unconscious beliefs and attitudes have been found to be associated with language and certain behaviors such as eye contact, blinking rates, and smiles. Teachers telegraph bias, even if they think they're not biased. And this bias isn't all bad. It's how 2-year-olds know how to dig into ice cream while being wary of those Brussels sprouts, which could actually be poison. So our goal is to monitor our bias so that it doesn't steer us. Once you're aware of your own hidden unconscious biases, you can monitor your thinking and attitudes so that your biases don't guide your behavior. Beyond changing your own behaviors, you can also become more aware of biases in others, including your students. And sometimes implicit biases aren't all that hidden. We may be all too aware that we clutch our purses when we see a Black man approaching us, or that we assume someone with a Southern accent isn't educated. These biases can be so deep that we doubt we'll ever be able to change them. But if we know we have them, we can try to short circuit them, and also to be conscious of whether we're allowing them to affect our thinking, words, and actions. To see how your bias shows up, you might decide to take some of the Harvard implicit bias tests. These tests don't actually check for right and wrong answers. They measure your reaction times when associating images or words with words like good and bad things. In other words, they're testing what's unconscious versus what you have to think about. And many test takers report that they can feel their hidden biases as they take the test. So next, we're going to watch a short video on implicit bias.
Our brain is hardwired to trust what's familiar and be suspicious of what's unfamiliar. It's a basic survival instinct that's helped keep us safe for thousands of years.
We unconsciously sort things into familiar versus unfamiliar, same versus different, them versus us. Here's a test. How do you feel about people who Own a handgun.
Don't attend church. Vote for the other candidate.
Are on welfare.
Don't eat meat.
Have tattoos.
Don't believe in marriage.
Drive an electric car.
Didn't go to college.
Don't speak English. Curse.
Are over 60.
Are disabled.
Drive the speed limit.
Love cats.
Love dogs. Can you feel your brain sorting people into groups? Was there a little them versus us happening? It can happen unconsciously.
All right. How did you feel? Intellectually, physically, and emotionally during that video? The image on this slide is one type of graphical representation of equality versus equity. There's a green background with bicycles and people, 4 of each on the top and 4 on the bottom. On the top, under the label equality, there are 4 bicycles, all the same size. Beginning on the left, there's a bicycle standing next to a person sitting in a wheelchair. Next, a very tall person scrunched over on the bike. And next is a modest-sized person for whom the bicycle seems appropriately sized. And finally, a very small person who can barely reach the pedals and certainly couldn't reach them while also sitting on the seat. This is equality. Everyone has access to the same thing. Below that, under the label equity, on the left side, a person on a hand cycle pedaling with her arms. Next, a very tall person on a very large bike that seems appropriate to their height. Then the same moderately sized person on a moderately sized bike that was in the equality image above. And then finally, a tiny bike that seems appropriately sized to a very small person who is riding it comfortably. That's equity. Everyone has what they need, but their needs are all different. Equity and equality are often used interchangeably, but treating people equally and treating people equitably are 2 very different things. Equality means you give everyone the same thing. Equity means you give everybody what they need according to their needs. I had an eye-opening moment once with a disabled person who was talking about how she hadn't used to identify as a disabled person until she realized that she wasn't actually disabled. It was society that made her disabled through its creation of certain structures that she was unable to navigate. Society has structured everything for the dominant group. In the US, that's typically able-bodied white Protestant men of Northern European descent who are heterosexual, cisgender, and right-handed. We've made you disabled because you can't walk up a flight of stairs, and that's all we've provided. We've made a left-hander abnormal by giving them scissors that only cut from the right hand. Inclusive teaching requires intentional practice over time. You can't think about it once and think you're done. It's a mindset that shapes your approach to course content and learning activities. Ideally, inclusive teaching stems from your own awareness about the ways that bias and systemic inequities, such as racism, sexism, and ableism, affect student learning experiences, the ways they experience them, and even what they are able to experience. Awareness is a muscle, and the more you exercise it, the stronger it gets. Okay, so we're going to go into these points in greater detail, but some inclusive teaching principles include creating an inclusive climate and sense of belonging for students, critically engaging difference, promoting transparency, and self-reflection and self-awareness. So inclusive climate and belonging. Students need to feel they belong. If I don't see people like me represented on the syllabus, then how can I do as well in this class as those who are represented? Several studies in the last decade show that students' feelings of belonging are strongly correlated to academic performance. Research shows that feeling excluded, marginalized, or devalued on campus or in a classroom can be a significant barrier to student learning and success. If you don't feel you belong here, it's hard to learn. You can facilitate a sense of academic belonging by making sure a broad range of social identities are represented in your syllabus, and by welcoming diverse voices and experiences. Make a point to choose examples from a variety of cultural domains to illustrate course concepts, and invite students to provide examples themselves and share your own experience. Educational psychology teaches that diverse classrooms where students from different backgrounds communicate different experiences and perspectives encourage students to think in more complex ways, which is necessary for an informed and thoughtful community. Thinking in complex ways requires the skills and willingness not to be timid while we ensure academic freedom, inclusion, and experimentation. This includes not just US issues of race and politics. International students, who at least in the past have comprised almost half of our student body, can feel marginalized by a faculty member who uses only US references or who doesn't understand that in certain cultures, the teacher is the authority and students don't speak or question that authority. Learn what students want to be called, and keep in mind that might be different from what's on the roster, and learn how to pronounce it. Get their pronouns right. If you have trouble remembering names, you can use tent cards, the cards you put in front of you, or name tags. And if you're on Zoom, it couldn't be easier. And you could do the same with your name and pronouns to signal to students that you value getting it right, and correct a student if they misgender another student. We all know something, and students have a lot to offer. Employing peer learning opportunities deepens learning because it's much harder to explain something to someone else than to simply learn it yourself. It also promotes collaboration and community building. Universal Design for Learning is a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning for all people based on scientific insights into how humans learn. It's about using multiple modes of engagement and recognizing that different students learn differently, and some students have learning disabilities. They use audio and video, text and graphics. Faculty who practice universal design for learning allow students to choose how they submit work. So a research paper or a website or a video or a game. Faculty promote more and broader student engagement by using small groups and pair share exercises to encourage participation from students who may be uncomfortable speaking in front of the whole class. Critical engagement of differences. So who's on your syllabus? The white Western canon has dominated higher education, and that needs to be challenged. We had a first-year student report that she was in a class on the history of the African diaspora, and all of the authors on the syllabus were white men. If there aren't non-white scholars and artists to be included in your syllabus, why is that? Talk about it with your class. Acknowledge the lack of representation and what needs to happen in your field to change that and to introduce diverse voices, perspectives, histories, and values. Who's missing from your syllabus? Keep asking yourself that, and select content by authors of diverse backgrounds and content that recognizes diversity and acknowledges barriers to inclusion. Emphasize the range of identities and backgrounds of experts who have contributed to your field as artists, performers, researchers, and scholars. This also helps students see themselves and their successful experiences in your course content. Some students will push back when they see that the syllabus is unrepresentative of anything other than the dominant culture, i.e., white, Western, hetero-cisgendered society. Faculty often ask students who they think should be included, but it shouldn't be on your students to educate you. Take the time to educate yourself about who's writing, researching, working, or creating in your fields. And if there really is a lack of diversity in that field, consider a discussion about the reasons for a history of limited access to the field. Why are some people or groups not represented? And what can be done to remedy that? Don't assume that all students will recognize the cultural references you use. Ask yourself how students with different identities might experience the course material. And consider promoting a class skeptic to challenge assertions, whether they agree or not, to generate diversity of thought. Transparent teaching. So we've been really promoting the principles of transparent teaching as we've been giving presentations on Gen Z. because Gen Z students will not do something just because you tell them to do it. But the truth is, transparent teaching is just smart. Students are more likely to persist through challenges when instructors communicate high standards, provide clear paths to success for all students, and are transparent about expectations and norms. This benefits all students, but especially first-generation students and other groups who have been traditionally underserved by higher education. Teaching students effective learning strategies, letting them know how much time they should be spending on specific assignments, providing assessment rubrics that outline clear criteria for success on those assignments, and sharing stories about your own challenges and successes in learning difficult material all promote transparency and inclusion and promote student learning. Your class shouldn't be a mystery. Tell students why you designed the course the way you did. Tell them why you chose a particular reading or activity. Clarify what you expect students to get from an experience. Then check in and ask them what they actually got out of it. Ask students to participate in decisions like determining how a group project will be evaluated or what constitutes work that would receive an A or that would be insufficient. These are all powerful tools that have been shown to improve both student engagement and deepen learning. We're going to return to the concept of implicit bias because it underlines so much of what we think and do and is the likeliest cause of harm. If you come to our workshop on implicit bias and microaggressions, we'll talk even more about uncovering unconscious beliefs.
Your brain, by some accounts, receives roughly 11 million pieces of information each second, but your conscious brain is only able to process about 40. How do you handle all the rest? You handle it because you're really using two brains. Your conscious brain, which works with facts and data, has very little capacity and processes information slowly, and your unconscious brain, which is habit and intuition driven, has huge capacity and is really fast. One of your unconscious brain's best tricks is its ability to recognize patterns and use them to assign people and things to categories, allowing your unconscious brain to deal with all of the known, not dangerous issues, and leave only the few unknown or dangerous issues to your conscious brain. This allows us to recognize a pattern and act on it, rather than having to think about every interaction as if we were experiencing it for the first time. We can glance at that four-legged animal and know if it's a wolf or a cocker spaniel. That recognition allows us to make assumptions about the animal facing us, that the wolf belongs to the wild animal category and is likely to be dangerous, or that the cocker spaniel is in the domestic dog category and not likely to be dangerous. The assumptions we make about these pattern groups are likely to be based on our own experiences, on information we have gained from our culture or background, or from the media we listen to or people we admire. Unfortunately, those assumptions are often wrong. When we categorize people, our brains apply two other tools. One is affinity bias, a hardwired preference to respond positively to people who look, sound, and act like ourselves. Brain imaging scans show that when people are shown images of faces that differ from their own, it activates in milliseconds activity in the part of the unconscious brain that alerts us to possible danger. This may reflect a survival tool left over from ancient times when danger often came from those outside our immediate group. Today, however, this means the associations and biases are likely to be unconsciously activated every time when we come across a member of a group, even if we consciously reject group stereotypes. In addition to affinity bias, our unconscious brain categorizes people into groups and then connects those groups to our learned ideas or constructs about what is good or bad. Now, we've decided whether someone is like us or not, and whether they're good or not, all within milliseconds of meeting them. So, what can you do to manage your unconscious biases? You've already started by just learning about unconscious bias. Now, identify your own biases and address one at a time by building inclusive habits. Remember, If you do not intentionally, deliberately, and proactively include, you will unintentionally exclude.
The body you inhabit, your self-presentation, the information you choose to share about yourself, all have an effect on student perception and comfort in the classroom. One thing you can do is take an inventory of the ways your own affiliations and identities, both those that are evident and those that are less visible or invisible, and consider how they may shape your own perceptions and connections with others and their perceptions and connections with you. For example, do students equally afford you authority? Do some make assumptions about you based on your appearance, your gender, your accent that may be accurate, that may be inaccurate or stereotypical? Also consider, do you believe that all students can succeed in your class? Really? There was a research study done a number of years ago in an elementary school. It was fifth graders, and they, hundreds of students. And the researchers told the teachers that 3 or 4 students, individual students in their class, had an exceptionally high IQ. Now, the truth is that wasn't true. All students in the class tested at relatively the same level, if you believe in IQ tests, in more or less the normal standard average range. But the teachers were told that these 3 students were incredibly smart. At the end of the year, those students did far better than the other students in the class. Not because they were smarter, but because the teachers expected them to do well. The teachers held them to very high standards, challenged them, and believed in them. So how we think about our students actually can affect their performance. So want to take a minute right now and ask you to ask yourself, what student behaviors, or it might be if you haven't taught before, a coworker or a partner or a stranger, what behaviors trigger strong emotions in you or distract your attention? How do you react to recurring frustrations like lateness, students' lack of preparation, a partner's insistence on getting to the airport 2 hours early, inappropriate use of technology, indifference or seeming indifference during a demonstration, or eating in class? Try not to think too much. Just think about what comes up for you and be honest with yourself. The only way to get at implicit bias and promote equity and inclusion is to be really honest yourself. I gave the example of eating in class because people might think that's neutral, but it's not. I mentored a faculty member once who was referred to me for support and mentoring because the 2 Black women in her class raised concerns about bias on the part of their instructor. She had singled them out for eating in class when other non-Black students were allowed to eat in class, and she didn't chastise them. She hadn't even been aware of it. For whatever reasons, their eating really bothered her in ways that the other students didn't. It's that kind of thing that we're encouraging you to try to raise from unconscious to conscious. Because once it's conscious, you can decide whether or how to act on it. And we really can't trust ourselves. I was teaching freshman writing, and we were required to take attendance. And it was the program's policy that if you missed more than 3 classes, your grade was docked, a practice I must say I do not like. I had the sense that these 2 particular students had missed a lot of classes. But at the end of the semester, when I went and looked at the attendance, no. Each had missed 3 classes and only 3 classes. Our impressions just really can't be trusted. If you find yourself in a situation wondering what to do, reach out to people. We're here to help and we want you to succeed. Talk to us, to colleagues, to your program director or chair. It's good to talk things through. And frankly, it's just good to talk about teaching.